He didn't expect salvation at an old bus stop. It was past midnight when Elvis eased his Cadillac to a halt under the flickering street lamp. The world felt hollow, every cheer and spotlight a distant echo. He slumped low in his seat, exhaustion etched in the hollows of his face. Joe Esposito watched him silently from the driver's seat, the hum of the engine the only answer to Elvis's unspoken plea for refuge. Then, through the rain-streaked glass, a trembling figure emerged. An elderly woman wrapped in an ill-fitting coat, clutching a threadbare tote. Without a word, she rose and approached the window, her eyes reflecting years of unseen hardship. In her gnarled hand, a small scrap of paper. "Elvis Presley," she whispered, though he never spoke his name. She placed the note in his outstretched palm, then melted back into the shadows. He unfolded it with numb fingers and froze, every muscle in his body taut with recognition. The paper's message was simple, but it pierced deeper than any spotlight. "Turn the car around. Now. Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story." Elvis pulled up to the curb of the deserted bus stop just after midnight, the Cadillac's headlights cutting through the wet haze of a January drizzle. His ribs still ached from the IV needles in Baptist Hospital, and his limbs felt heavy with dehydration and exhaustion. He'd slipped away from Graceland under cover of darkness, desperate for a breath of Memphis air that didn't smell of antiseptic and painkillers. He killed the engine and leaned back, staring through the rain-spattered windshield at the lone figure on the bench. An elderly woman, wrapped in a threadbare overcoat against the chill, held a battered cloth bag on her lap. She rocked gently, head bowed. Elvis pushed open the driver's door. Joe Esposito reached across, hands at ready, but Elvis merely shook his head. "Give me a minute," he whispered. He climbed out and approached the woman, rain speckling the collar of his long coat. She looked up, startled, but did not rise. Hands trembling, she unfolded a scrap of yellowed paper and held it through the glass. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears, her features worn by time and sorrow. Elvis slid into the passenger seat and took the paper, the heater's weak breath warming his fingers. The woman stood, brushing raindrops from her coat, and in the dim glow of the dash, he saw her chin quiver. She turned away and faded into the night, footsteps echoing down an empty street. Joe peered through the windshield. "Boss, she's gone." His voice was a low rumble, like the cavernous silence that had swallowed them the moment the engine died. Elvis unfolded the note on his lap, hands steady despite the tremor in his chest. 3 lines, penned in a looping script that seemed both fragile and urgent. "You've carried 1,000 voices. Don't lose your own. M.L." He pressed his forehead against the wheel, as though the weight of those words might crack the glass. The rough pavement glistened in the headlight beams, but everywhere else was night. "She wasn't asking," he said, voice raw. "She was reminding." Joe started the engine and eased back onto the road. Elvis studied the note, remembering every voice he'd ever amplified, from screaming fans to quiet collaborators, from the scout at Sun Records to the preacher in Tupelo, who'd laid hands on him in '56. But this was neither demand nor flattery. It was a summons. Over the next 2 days, Elvis made calls to everyone he trusted. His cousin Billy, the local pastor who'd baptized him, the taxi driver who'd ferried him home after those early sun sessions. Each lead circled back to a name: Mabel Laurie, once a nurse at Baptist, now living alone in a dilapidated trailer on the outskirts of town. No family, no press, no fanfare. Elvis donned a simple turtleneck sweater and jeans, left Joe with clear instructions, and drove out Highway 51 under a slate-gray dawn. The trailer park lay hidden behind a cluster of pines, the single-wide units sagging under blankets of dead leaves. He hesitated at the screen door, hesitating to disturb whatever remnants of peace Mabel Laurie had carved out. She opened the door before he could knock, her posture rigid, surprise flashing across her lined face. The years hadn't been kind. Silver threads in her black hair, eyes shadowed by loss. He raised the note between them. "You sent this," he said softly. Her shoulders sagged. "I thought you might need a reminder." He stepped inside, taking in the cramped living room lit by one flickering lamp. Medical textbooks and faded photographs crowded a small table. A single framed portrait caught his eye. His own face, beaming from a 1958 departmental newsletter, beside the caption, "Nurse Laurie cares for our hero." She followed his gaze. "Your mother was in that ward when she got sick. I held her hand while she slipped away." Her voice cracked. "You were only a boy back then." The memory hit him like a punch to the gut. He pressed a hand to his chest. He had carried that boy inside him all these years, just enough to survive the spotlight, but never quite enough to heal the wounds left by grief. Mabel sank onto a threadbare couch. He sat beside her, the distance between king and caretaker collapsing. No bodyguards, no tape recorders, just two hearts beating in the quiet of a run-down trailer. She offered no tears now, only that same calm resolve. "I want to hear your voice," she said, eyes steady. "Not the voice they paid to hear. Yours." Elvis swallowed. He thought of the empty concert halls, the echo of applause that never quite reached his soul. He thought of the studio, where every take sounded just a little off. And he thought of Mabel Laurie, offering him what no producer ever could, the permission to be himself. He pulled his coat tighter, rainwater dripping from its hem, and nodded. "Thank you," he whispered. Outside, the pine needles rattled in the rising wind, and somewhere beyond the trailer park, a freight train howled across the tracks, a reminder that even in this stillness, life kept moving. But for the first time in months, Elvis Presley felt the weight lift, if only slightly. He had been reminded of who he was and who he still could be. Elvis spent the next 48 hours in a haze of quiet urgency. He hardly slept, nor did he concern himself with calls from Colonel Parker or reminders from RCA about deadlines. In his mind, only one question echoed. Who was that woman? And what did she see in me? Shortly after dawn on Tuesday, he summoned Joe Esposito to Graceland's back gate. Joe arrived in a rumbling black Lincoln, breath clouding in the chill. Elvis climbed in without a word, clutching the crumpled note in his fist. "Find her," Elvis said simply. "Where did she come from? Who is M.L.?" Joe nodded, setting the car in motion, and reached for his notebook. "We'll start with the city shelters, the bus depots, any clinics she might have visited," he replied. "And I'll call Reverend Carter at Mount Zion. He knew your mother back in '58. They crossed the Mississippi River into North Memphis, the Cadillac gliding past shuttered storefronts and pastel shotgun houses. At each turn, Elvis peered through the rain-slick windshield, half expecting to glimpse the frail figure leaning on her battered bag. By midday, Joe had made 4 phone calls. One lead came from the pastor, a woman named Mabel Laurie, age 68, former nurse at Baptist Hospital, now living in a trailer park off Eudora Street. She'd been spotted carting groceries by a Pantry Plus. Her trailer number, A faded 17 was scratched into a low concrete block beside a sagging screen door. Elvis dropped Joe at the edge of the park and disappeared around the corner alone. He walked past trailers under strings of peeling Christmas lights, past families gathered on sagging porches, until he found number 17. The metal siding was rust-streaked, the windows curtained in yellowing lace. He knocked once, softly, and waited, back pressed against the door. After a moment, the screen creaked open. A woman's lined face peered out, gray hair drawn back, eyes wary. He recognized her at once, though she seemed to shrink at the sight of him. "Mrs. Laurie?" he asked, voice low. Her eyes widened. For a heartbeat, she seemed uncertain whether to slam the door or throw it wide. Then she stepped back and wrapped the door around him, ushering him inside. The shabby interior was lit by a single lamp that cast long shadows over threadbare linoleum. A dressmaker's mannequin stood in one corner, draped in a moth-eaten shawl. "Elvis?" she whispered, and her voice trembled. How did you?" He held up the note. "You gave this to me." His voice cracked with fatigue, and something deeper. Gratitude, perhaps. "I came to thank you." She nodded, pushing her glasses up the bridge of her nose. Her hands, those same hands that had held his sick mother's during her final hours, trembled as she placed a worn Bible on the table. "I thought you might need a reminder." Her gaze flicked to the note, then to him. "I didn't expect you'd actually come." He sank onto a sagging sofa, rain still dripping from his collar. Joe Esposito lingered just outside the screen door, like a silent sentinel. Elvis folded the note slowly, as though it might disintegrate in his hands. "You knew my mother?" Mabel swallowed, her throat working. "Gladys. She was so young, so frightened when she came in that night. I held her hand until she slept. You were just a boy, but you stayed by her bed, quiet, hopeful." Elvis closed his eyes, a surge of pain and tenderness lifting from his chest. "I was so worried. I felt so helpless." She reached across and took his hand, frail, lined, yet warm. "You learned to carry a light then. Don't let them snuff it out." He nodded without speaking, the weight of a lifetime of applause and studio lights suddenly hollow beside the soft insistence of her voice. For a long moment they sat in silence, two souls bound by loss and the fragile promise of kindness. Mabel rose and cleared a space at the table. She poured coffee into chipped mugs and slid one toward him. The aroma, bitter, real, woke him better than any applause ever had. Outside, the world hustled on, oblivious to this small miracle in a trailer park. But inside, under the hum of a single lamp, Elvis Presley found a sanctuary he had never known he needed, and a reminder that even a king could learn from those who dwell in quiet corners. In the hush that followed, Elvis finally spoke. "Thank you," he said simply. And for the first time in months, his voice sounded as if it might carry him forward. 3 days passed in a surge of quiet urgency. Elvis had returned to RCA Studio B the very night he found Mabel's trailer, but this time with a different purpose. Not to churn out another hit, but to reckon with the conviction she'd awakened in him. Late that first evening, after their conversation, Elvis instructed Joe Esposito to arrange for Mabel Laurie's placement in a small convalescent home east of Memphis, a place with steady meals and round-the-clock care. News of the arrangement reached her by way of a nurse who left a message at her trailer. Mabel's reply was a simple scrawl on a scratch pad. "Thank you, but I'm not done yet." Elvis read the note twice before understanding. She would not be shuffled off like an old record. She was adamant on living life in her own terms, and he respected that. Over the next week, Elvis fell into a new routine. Mornings in the studio resumed their familiar grind. He'd play and record, striving for a spark of authenticity, as if chasing a truth he'd all but forgotten. But each night, at exactly 9 o'clock, he would dial the unlisted number Joe had secured. At first, Mabel answered without surprise. "Good evening, Mr. Presley," she'd say, voice tinged with weary amusement. "Evening, Mabel," he'd reply, half smiling, half choked. "Did you eat well tonight?" From her end came the rustle of quilted blankets and a faint hum of late-night traffic. They would talk about nothing and everything. He'd ask how the nurse was, how they treated her, and she'd deflect with gentle patience. "They're kind enough, but not you," she'd joke. "I'd rather be across the room with Wurlitzer and reverb than within earshot of that ringtone." Elvis treasured these calls. In her voice, he heard the same steadfast compassion that had guided him as a boy at Gladys's bedside. It was that fidelity of heart he'd been missing, and now, perched between the microphone and the mixer, he found himself humming a melody that carried her resilience. One night, around 3 in the morning, the phone went unanswered. The line clicked, then went dead. Elvis frowned, but the studio clock signaled no time to worry. He spent the next hour coaxing rich, reedy chords from his guitar, shaping them into the opening bars of a new song, a lament of apologies unsaid, of faith tested in shadow. By Friday, the song had taken shape. He titled it, "Where No One Stands Alone," and its lyrics spoke of loneliness, of reaching across chasms of doubt, of finding grace in unexpected kindness. The next session, he laid down a raw demo, vocals thin with emotion, piano tremulous, and, echoing softly underneath, the distant sound of footsteps on vinyl plank, an homage to Mabel's weary trek. That afternoon, as the final mix spun towards the master tape, Joe broached the subject of releasing the song as a single. Colonel Parker balked at the idea. Too personal, too gospel. Yet Elvis insisted. He demanded that the track be complete, released or not, that the moment be immortalized. Late that evening, a telegram arrived at Graceland. Elvis stared at it by the dim glow of his bedside lamp. "Regret to inform you, Mabel Laurie passed away this morning in her sleep. Sincerely, Sister Agnes. Hope Springs, Rest Home." He crumpled the paper, chest tightening. For a long while he did not move. Then, carefully, he drew the small Bible she had given him on their first meeting from the nightstand, flipped to the worn margin where she had penciled a single verse. "Let not your heart be troubled." Inside the front cover he discovered another envelope, thin and gray. He recognized her handwriting, spidery and resolute. "My dear boy, you've carried more lives in your songs than most carry in one. I lived, and I will die, believing you'll find your way back to that light. Keep singing for the lonely. Yours, Mabel." He read it 3 times, tears pooling in his eyes and sliding down unbidden. He held the note to his chest, its edges pressed against the fading warmth of his own heartbeat. 2 days later, Elvis reconvened with the RCA producers. He placed the crumpled telegram and Mabel's letter on the console. With quiet authority, he announced, "That record is going out. Not as a gimmick or a tribute, just as it is. Because someone once reminded me that I was never alone, and I want others to hear it." Though the label grumbled, they acquiesced. On December 14th, 1969, Where No One Stands Alone debuted. Voice raw, piano sparse, and with a gospel echo that felt like a hand taking yours in the dark. Across the airwaves, a quiet revolution stirred. Listeners wrote in with stories of grief and hope, of late-night radios and tired hearts finding solace in one man's unguarded confession. And somewhere in the hush between notes, Elvis heard Mabel's voice again. Don't let them snuff out your soul. He pressed his ear to the speaker, closed his eyes, and let that promise carry him home. The day, Where No One Stands Alone, was scheduled to hit the airwaves in mid-December, felt both ordinary and profound in equal measure. Elvis rose before dawn, the faint Tennessee dawnlight filtering through the plantation shutters in his bedroom at Graceland. He'd slept poorly, visions of Mabel's kind eyes and worn Bible passage lingering behind eyelids heavy as curtains. But there was purpose now, a charge to carry forward what she'd begun, a message of hope for those who felt lost in silence. On the morning of release, he visited Studio B one last time. The control room was hushed, save for the hum of reels being loaded and the gentle hiss of tape. He slipped inside unannounced, greeted by a few wide eyes and nervous nods. He didn't speak a word. Instead, he walked to the back booth, found the engineer, and pointed to the monitor as the opening piano bars trickled through the speakers. The demo, unedited, unvarnished, filled the room. He stood, arms folded, watching colleagues lean forward, blink back surprise, and then close their eyes, as though the song were a confession spoken directly to their own hearts. At exactly 2:15 p.m., the DJ's voice rose over WLAC's Nocturne program, reciting the introduction that Elvis had personally whispered into the microphone the previous night. This next song, somebody once reminded me that we're never truly alone. Take it from a man who's lost and found a lifeline in an unlikely place. Here's Where No One Stands Alone. Then the music unfurled, soft, resolute, unafraid of its own fragility. Listeners midway through errands, huddled near transistor radios in living rooms, paused. The song's simple refrain, "When shadows fall and words won't come, reach out your hand, you're not undone," echoed through crackling speakers and quieted the city's roar for a moment. In the hours that followed, messages began to pour in. The switchboard at Radio Memphis was besieged. Calls from heartbroken mothers, war-worn veterans, factory workers on shift, all touched by a vulnerability they'd never expected from the king. One letter, from a schoolteacher in West Tennessee, said, "I played this for my students as they grieved the loss of their principal. For the first time, they let their tears fall, then held each other and stood together." Meanwhile, in a modest trailer home just south of town, Mabel Laurie's nurse received a copy of Elvis's note. Printed in full, framed beneath the photo of Gladys Presley's bedside smile, it read, "You gave the world your voice. Don't let them take your soul." The nurse paused, then placed it on the small mantel above Mabel's favorite armchair. Even in quiet passing, Mabel's final gift continued to cradle lives she would never meet. Back at Graceland, Colonel Parker fumed at the unexpected success of the single, but Elvis remained calm. Over dinner with Joe Esposito, he peered across the mahogany table and said, "I didn't do this for profit or headlines. I did it because someone, some kind woman, looked right through the glare and saw a man who'd forgotten how to sing from the soul. I owe it to the rest of the world to remember that lesson." Joe nodded, his expression a blend of relief and admiration. In that moment, the myth of Elvis Presley and the man behind the sequins became one. Weeks later, Elvis returned to Studio B, not to record, but simply to sit at the piano. He lifted Mabel's Bible, opened to her penciled verse, and played the melody of Where No One Stands Alone by heart. No mics, no engineers, just the whisper of keys and the memory of a stranger's compassion guiding his hands. He closed his eyes, imagining Mabel beside him once more, offering that steadfast reminder, "You are never alone." In the years that followed, the song took on a quiet life of its own. Church choirs adopted it as a hymn of solace. Veterans sang it at reunions. Strangers slipped its handwritten lyrics under the doors of those who suffered loss. Yet, through it all, Elvis never performed it on stage again. He reserved it for nights like that first one, solitary hours when the heart ached for honesty more than applause. And when Elvis's own light dimmed in 1977, fans discovered, tucked within his private archives, the original demo reel stamped in his neat cursive, "Preserve this truth." The recording, and the story behind it, has since become legend, a testament to what can happen when fame lifts its veil and sees the human need beneath. Because sometimes the most profound influence does not come from pyrotechnics and roaring crowds, but from a simple act of listening. By a man once called a king, who learned that every soul, no matter how famous or forgotten, deserves the chance to stand not alone, but together.